Our first order of business is Senator Corson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just wanted to give a quick introduction. I've got an intern working with me who was a former high school student in my district, is now a student at University of Kansas and has an interest in law school, Josh Conklin. Josh, if you want to stand up. And so Josh is going to be in on Tuesdays and Thursdays for our work in Judiciary and Utilities, and I'm really excited to have him with me. And like I mentioned, he has an interest in law school and in the work of this committee.
Well, thank you, Senator, and welcome to committee and to the Senate, Josh. And I will be seeing you also in Senate Utilities Committee because I serve on that committee with Senator Corson. So welcome. Committee, are there any requests for bill introductions? I don't see any. Or do we have any bill requests for introductions in the audience? Not seeing any. Then we will have our presentation by Heather Cessna, Executive Director of Kansas State Board of Indigent Defense Services. Welcome to committee, Heather, and please introduce yourself.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairman. And I am Heather Cessna, and I am here for the Board of Indigent Defense Services. I'm going to pull up some slides here. What I'm going to spend my time talking about today, and obviously feel free to interrupt as you have questions as we get started. But what I'm going to spend my time talking about today is a combination of a couple of reports that we've issued over the course of the last month or so. One dealing with staffing issues that was specifically requested by our budget committees last year on the impact of recent salary adjustments with our public defense system and its connection to our turnover rates. The other report, and both of these can be found on our website at sbids.org under the publications tab, also talks about our workloads, which goes to the discussion that we want to have about attorney shortages. So as we get started here, I think it's important that we have make sure that we're kind of on the same page with some starting assumptions. And that is that one of the main things to keep in consideration as we're talking about these issues is that obviously the provision of attorneys in criminal cases is a constitutional right required of the state by the United States Constitution and Gideon versus Wainwright, and that there are minimum levels of representation that are required as part of that under Strickland v. Washington for reasonably effective assistance of counsel. The other thing to keep in mind is that we don't have any control over the number of cases that come into our system. We are very much limited on how we can deal with the volume of cases, and we have to do it from the back end of trying to meet our caseloads as they come in, because we do not have the ability to have any control over the charging decisions of local prosecutors, or obviously relatively little control over the things that the legislature chooses to criminalize, or what level of felonies you choose to assign to to types of crimes. And so while a lot of my comments today are going to be directed at the things that we do have control over, which is hiring and maintaining our current experienced defenders and trying to staff for our appropriate caseloads going forward and addressing the shortages of counsel that we have. There is sort of this larger conversation that probably needs to be had in a way that I am certainly more than happy to participate in, but it's not a conversation that I necessarily have a lot of control over, which is the larger question of what it is that we're working on as far as trying to reduce the amount of cases that are coming into our system in the first place. So with that, I will hop into my presentation. Obviously, like I said, as we're going along, if you have questions, please feel free to interrupt. One of the reasons why there's this connection, is that not coming up? Sorry, technical difficulties. Is it showing there? Oh, I've got it up here. Sorry, we even tested this ahead of time and it worked just fine. Do you want to mess with it? Do you want me to restart it? There you go.
Share it again.
Yeah. Oh, there we go. Perfect. Thank you very much for your assistance. One of the reasons why this is very important to consider the connection between the shortages of counsel that I know you heard about earlier this week from the Chief Justice across Kansas, and acutely the shortages of counsel in criminal defense in particular, and our public defender's offices, is because although our assigned counsel private program covers is the only defense services that are offered in a large number of judicial districts and a large number of counties, those jurisdictions that are solely reliant on those panel attorneys only produce about 35% of Kansas's criminal felony caseload. The areas where we have public defender offices, the jurisdictions where we have public defender's offices, they do cover a smaller number of judicial districts and a smaller number of counties, but they do cover jurisdictions that produce about 65% of Kansas's criminal felony caseload. So when our public defender's offices are not able to keep cases because of the turnover rates that we have, and because of the salary issues that we have, and because of the high workloads we have, those cases then end up having to be temporarily refused and offloaded to our assigned counsel program. And when we already have shortages in our assigned counsel program, that further exacerbates the issues. So as board, what we have decided to focus on is looking at specifically what can we do to retain our current experienced employees, what we can do to enhance their ability to stick with our system longer so that they're able to take more cases as they gain experience level in their offices, so that we're not further exacerbating the already difficult situation with the panel attorneys where we don't have enough criminal defense attorneys on our panels. So that's kind of some context for why this is important. One of the issues that we've been studying very carefully for the last 4 years is our turnover rates. In 2019, our turnover rates for public defenders specifically were that we were losing 1 out of every 4 public defenders. So that's a 25% turnover rate for our public defenders specifically in 2019. In 2022, after several years of no salary adjustments, that the turnover rate that we were suffering in 2022 was down a little bit, but it was still very significant. It was 1 out of every 5 public defenders that we were losing. As you can imagine, those kind of catastrophic losses of experienced public defenders and criminal defense counsel in our public defender system has a huge impact on our ability to handle the caseloads that are coming into our public defender offices. Because when you lose those experienced people, it is very difficult for us to replace those experienced people with the same level of experience. Typically, you're starting a little bit from scratch, oftentimes with relatively new grads who are eager to be there, but take time to get up to speed. And that makes it very difficult for us to handle those caseloads. And so 4 years ago, we started doing a well-being survey with our employees, and it covers a whole lot of different questions. But one of the questions that we asked was, how many of you had considered leaving our public defender system within the last year? And repeatedly, year after year, that was a fairly high majority of individuals who said that they had contemplated leaving the public defender system. And when we asked what was the biggest detractor from your well-being at work that contributed to this desire to potentially think about leaving the public defender system, consistently year over year, these same answers come up, which is caseloads or lack of staffing and support, and pay, lack of raises and promotions. So it's pretty clear to us as a board then that those are 2 of the biggest issues that we need to address. Those are what you've been hearing over and over again from us, from our budget requests over the last couple of years. Just so you can kind of see on our slides, and this is included in the testimony that I submitted to the committee. If you want to have you should have a better view of that on the paper copy, if this is a little hard to read here. There is definitely a very clear connection between our turnover rates and the history of pay adjustments as we've had. One of the big pay adjustments that we were able to get was a year and a half ago to get closer to some pay parity with prosecutors. Unfortunately, We are still significantly far off from the pay parity with prosecutors issue because the time frame that it took us to get the adjustment that was imposed a year and a half ago also was a time frame during which the prosecutors' offices continued to increase their salaries. And so we are still behind, even though we're better off than we were initially. But you can see when you look at when those pay raises were implemented in July of 2022, so after we were having a high turnover rate of 1 out of every 5 public defenders leaving, that our turnover rates in 2023 went down to 9.7% for the entire agency and about 8.6% for public defenders specifically. That was a huge impact. And that's not rocket science, right? Obviously, if you adjust salaries and you have a more comparable pay for people of equivalent experience with the same prosecutors who are doing the same type of cases directly across the aisle, you're going to be able to retain those people. And that ultimately is who we're losing candidates and employees to. Is there are very few places to do criminal defense or criminal law in Kansas. Most of the time you're doing it as a prosecutor or as a public defender or as a public defense attorney appointed counsel. And so when we lose people because of pay issues, it is frequently to those prosecutors' offices. So that pay parity piece with our prosecutors' offices is particularly important to us retaining our employees. The reason why this is important is because at the same time that we're fighting the turnover rates and trying to maintain our experienced employees, we also have this additional piece of a general shortage of counsel throughout Kansas, and specifically a shortage of criminal defense counsel. So the exacerbation of our hiring issues in bids is having a significant impact on making that worse on our panels. And we additionally have the problem of even if we were to be able to maintain every experienced employee that we have, even if we were able to fill every vacancy that we have and keep it filled with no empty vacancies at all during the year, we still are understaffed and under FTE'd for the number of cases that come into our system. And that's the subject of our other our workloads report that I and Clayton Perkins, our chief public defender of our Capitol Appellate Defender Office, worked on over most of the fall in order to get out. In September of 2023, the National Center for State Courts, the American Bar Association, the RAND Corporation, and Lawyer Hanlon out of St. Louis created and promulgated new updated national standards for our public defense workloads. The old national standards that you guys have probably heard and are familiar with were based in 1973. They weren't based on any actual methodology. It was just sort of a shot in the dark. And it said generally that the old standard said generally that attorneys should not have more than 150 felonies per year per attorney, but there was no distinctions made for what level of felonies. Obviously, 150 murders is a whole different world than 150 probation violations. Those standards were widely recognized as being phenomenally outdated, and so these groups came together, including the National Center for State Courts, which I think is important because they are also the ones that do the judicial reviews of their workloads, came together and created new national standards. What you see on this slide under the case type and case weights section in the green on the side is the updated standards for how many hours it takes for an attorney on average to be able to meet the minimum requirement under the Constitution of reasonably effective assistance of counsel on these various types of cases. I will tell you that our public defenders last year, because of the number of cases that they had, even with a lot of our offices refusing cases temporarily for periods of time because of our caseload issues and our staffing issues, averaged about 12 hours per attorney per year per case, regardless of the severity level of the case. As you can see here, probation violations require to meet minimum constitutional standards, 13.5 case hours, and cases like murder and things like that end up getting up into the 248, above 200 range for the number of hours that are required to meet those minimum standards. So it's pretty obvious when you look at those that we have a significant problem with our lack of staffing for our caseloads. The additional problem with that is that not only do we need more attorneys to meet those standards, but those standards also assume that you have a fully staffed office with sufficient support personnel to be able to support that attorney, because the hours involved in the new updated national standards only talk about attorney hours, because they're assuming that you have staff to support all of that. And the National Association for Public Defense has the clearest staffing ratios that they put out. That's what's in the yellow chart on the same page, of how many investigators per attorney, legal assistants per attorney, mental health professionals or social workers per attorney, and office administrative staff is required for every 3 or 4 attorneys. We are definitely very low on our staff ratios as well. And so before we can even begin to really significantly address the offloading of cases onto our assigned counsel panels and work on the exacerbation of that shortage problem for our private counsel, we have to make some meaningful progress on being able to maintain our attorneys in the public defense system and being able to staff them appropriately for the workloads that we already know that we have. Our report goes into the analysis of our caseloads issue in very great minute detail. So if you need some light reading before bedtime, please take a look at it. It's a fairly long report. It lays out our methodology for how we applied all of these standards so that you can better understand it. But just highly summarized, our assumptions based on the reported number of cases coming out of the jurisdictions that are covered by our existing public defender offices, or soon to be existing public defender offices, require that we need approximately 400 full-time employed trial attorneys to meet those caseloads. We currently have 123 full-time employees for those public defenders for those caseloads. For the jurisdictions that are covered entirely by private counsel, we calculated out that we need approximately 216 equivalent full-time attorneys taking nothing but appointed cases, which the vast majority of the attorneys that take cases on our panels do not take all bids cases, because our hourly rate is too low to be able to sustain a significant law practice at that level. And so while we have more than 200 attorneys on our panels, they do not meet the full-time equivalent part of this equation. So what we're looking at here and what we have prioritized for our budget requests going forward, what we need from all of you as legislators, is some significant support for some very specific items. In our budget request this year, we've asked for an additional 25 full-time employee staff for our offices. This includes a very small amount of what we've identified as key critical staff for a number of offices, including some capital offices, a lot of our trial offices, as well as our administrative office, in order to give us the capacity to be able to better hire and recruit and fill vacant positions that we currently have, and also be able to, looking forward, as we know that we're going to have to continue asking year after year for additional staff to meet these caseload issues, that we have the capacity to be able to do that. So we have a small request for FTEs this year in our budget. We also have a request for additional adjustments to our salaries in order to both help with recruitment and retention of our salaries. Pay parity with prosecutors was a request in our budget this year. To give you just a short summary of what that looks like, we did a series of core requests for a key number of prosecutors' offices over the summer and determined that our starting salaries, even if the prosecutors' offices have salary ranges that are fairly comparative to our salary ranges, frequently their starting salary for inexperienced employees is $10,000 to $15,000 to $20,000 higher in practice than what we are currently paying as starting salaries in our public defender's offices. So the pay parity with prosecutors is really aimed hard at bringing up those starting salaries to be more competitive with prosecutors. It also addresses some of the then potentially resulting salary compression in the middle to make sure that we're also accounting for the experienced people who we want to make sure we're retaining. As an alternative, our board did put forth a request that will not help with recruitment, but will help with, at the very minimum, retention of attorneys. And that is a regular salary adjustment. It's approximately 5%, but it also includes a significant a chunk of money to address merit raises for individuals who've gone through our performance management process and received a 4 of exceeding expectations or a 5 of excellent on their performance reviews. So that's an alternative pay request that we've also made in our budget. We are also going to be running a bill again this year to make our assigned counsel panel payments permanent in our statute. For the last several years, we've been paying $120 an hour by special budget proviso. We are working with a sponsor on getting a bill refiled to make that a permanent part of our statute so that our attorneys are better supported on our panels and know that they can rely on that rate going forward. Without a special budget proviso or without the statutory change, the hourly rate would go back from $120 an hour to $80 an hour, which I think would be catastrophic to our panels across the state. The other thing that we're asking for support on is we have a couple of infrastructure requests, including some funding for some needed lease space to accommodate our current offices that had needed additional lease space in order for our employees to be able to have sufficient places to be able to do their jobs, as well as some additional funding for our training department in order to make sure that we're training all of these attorneys at a minimum level of competency so that we are, and hopefully better than a minimum level of competency, so that they feel like they're being supported. And that's another reason they will hopefully stay with us as opposed to leaving and going elsewhere. And finally, like I said, the numbers that we're talking about for the attorney shortages, the fact that we're going to continue to have especially a rural attorney shortage problem as we continue to have a lot of practitioners retiring out of the practice and not a lot of people going back into the practice in some of these areas. While we definitely need to enhance our staffing in order to meet the most acute problems that we have in our public defender's offices and on our panels, that is not going to be the end-all solution. The ability to recruit additional attorneys requires that there be additional attorneys coming out of law schools at a higher rate than what they are, and that they're interested in going into criminal defense in some of these rural areas, which it has been very difficult traditionally to recruit those areas. And so while we absolutely need some additional help with our staffing and our FTEs and all of that, and maintaining our assigned counsel rate and all of that, that is not the end of the conversation. We're going to have to ask all of you to participate in that larger question of when you're hearing bills that go from a severity level 10 to a severity level 5. Well, when you look back at that chart of how many hours that requires for a public defender to be able to handle that case, that makes a huge difference in our staffing needs. And we're trying to both answer our fiscal notes with more detailed information about those changes so that you can make better decisions about those things going forward, so you're more aware of what that impact is on us. But certainly those are policy questions that you all are going to have to grapple with going forward, because we're not going to be able to meet this issue with just staffing alone. So I'm obviously more than happy to have be participating in those conversations, and to continue to keep all of you informed on the ongoing issues that we have and the work that we're doing to try to address those issues. But we definitely are not too proud to stand here and ask you for your support on some of the things that we need to have in order to address these things effectively.
Thank you very much, Heather. That was a very thorough update and a lot of information. Appreciate it. And first, we have Senator Wilborn with a couple questions.
Thank you again. That was a great update, and obviously most of us here, I assume, are sympathetic to your plight. A couple of questions. One is, do you have a fiscal note or a fiscal price tag of these asks that you have?
For our budget request, yeah, we have the I can give you the detailed information in our budget request on how much each of those cost. So the pay salary adjustments that we're asking for pay parity is around $6 million. The 25 new FTEs is under $2 million. So, and I can give you the more detailed rundown of that as well.
And that's kind of important to know. Second question, if I may, Madam Chair, is, and you alluded to it, what is the salary range? I know you talked $80 an hour. Could you kind of give me an idea of what these attorneys make?
Are you asking about salary ranges for our public defenders or the cost of doing business for our assigned counsel? Because those are kind of two different answers. So I want to make sure I'm responding.
Well, your addition was good. Give me both.
Okay. So I'll start with the assigned counsel. That's a little clearer. So our current rate is $120 an hour paid by our special budget proviso. When you're looking at comparable rates, for instance, the federal appointed counsel rate for their appointed counsel panels is closer to like 156 or so. I may be just a little off on that in case they've updated it recently, but so we're still significantly below that, even if we were to stay at 120 or to continue going up a little bit higher. One of our budget requests was to go up to 140, and we've got the associated funds in our budget requested for that as an enhancement. The KBA did a study back in 2017 on what the going rate of private attorney services was. It wasn't specific to criminal defense, but their private going rate was about $250 an hour, which I think that is significantly lower than it would be now. Usually, like if we have to hire attorneys for any kind of a special issue, oftentimes that conversation, and we have to negotiate them down, starts out at closer to $400 or $350. So I think if you ask around to the attorneys, as to what their hourly rates are, even at 120, it's still a heck of a bargain for the services that you're getting. On the attorney side for our public defenders, our starting salaries start out right now at $62,500. As I said, the Attorney General's office has been advertising initial starting salaries at closer to $75,000 to $80,000 for similarly situated positions. The prosecutors' offices that we surveyed were kind of a range between 75 and almost 90,000 for starting salaries. Johnson County, as you can imagine, was on the high end of that. Sedgwick County and Shawnee and Wyandotte were on the low end. So that's kind of the range for like starting salaries. Our current top paid public defenders in the state, so we're talking about like chief public defenders who have 25 plus years of experience. These are generally our chiefs who are in charge of their offices, and specifically our capital chiefs that are death penalty qualified, are making less than $140,000 a year. So that's kind of the range from the starting salary at 62 to, if I want to say off the top of my head, it's like 136 something for the top end, but definitely under 140. So that's kind of the range for what our current salaries look like. The funding that we're trying to get to would primarily be towards raising that low end of our salary range up because we have such a huge number of attorneys who have relatively little experience because we've had so much turnover that the people that we've hired to replace tend to be people who are 1, 2, 3, maybe 4 years at the most out of school. So the large number of our attorneys that we have in our agency are at that low end of the salary range. So the bulk of the funding that we're asking for the pay parity with prosecutors would go towards raising up those attorneys at the bottom end of the range. There is a piece in there for some of our staff too, just to make sure they're not getting too far behind. But that's kind of where that lands. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you for your thorough response.
Yeah.
Thank you, Senator Gossage.
Thank you. Thank you for being here. A couple of questions. One, even though I've served on the KBIDS board, I was surprised to see 84% of all criminal felonies receive appointed counsel. That's kind of a sad state of affairs. What is the income qualification to receive that?
So we use the federal poverty guidelines as part of that income assessment, and the income assessments are done by individual judges depending on circumstances with people's obligations. Obviously, if you've got child support payments and things like that, we want to make sure we're not leaving children without support because of your criminal case, that kind of thing. So the individual judges make those determinations, but it is largely based on the federal poverty guidelines.
And what percentage of the federal poverty level?
I have to look back at what that actually is because it changes every year on the bottom of our forms. But our forms are actually on our website. So
okay,
yeah.
I'd be interested in knowing that. Thank you. And
Yeah.
the couple of other questions that I have, if I may, Madam Chair, is in your chart here you have this NAPD recommended ratio per attorney. So given that you said we have 123 attorneys, right? So if it's 1 for every 3, that would be about 40 staff needed in that category, 30 in the next, 40 in the next, and 30 in the next. That's 170 staff. And you said you wanted 25 FTE more. How many FTE do you currently have?
So our total current FTEs, and this includes those staffing ratios are specifically for just our trial level attorneys. Our total FTEs for our entire agency, that includes obviously appellate, capital, all of those things, plus the trial level attorneys, is 289.23. And we certainly do not have the staff in our trial level offices to meet those ranges, even based on the 123 public defenders that we have in our trial level offices. And so about half of that 25 FTE staffing requests there's a couple public defenders included in that were key needs in some of our capital offices, but actually a lot of that request includes investigators and legal assistants for our trial offices because we do not meet those staffing ranges for the current employees that we have.
So to be clear, is the 123 attorneys included in the 289?
Yes.
They are. Okay.
Yes.
And then finally, when you said you can't do it with 123, really need closer to 400.
Mm-hmm.
And if that was the case, then, and if we're going 1 for every, we're looking at 466 of just these folks that are assisting attorneys.
Yeah.
So it just seems unreachable, does it not?
Well, and that's one of the reasons why I think we have to come at it from both ends. I think we have to talk about being able to meet and provide the minimum level of required representation that we need for the caseloads that we currently have as much as we can and as quickly as we can in a reasonable manner, understanding that if the legislature suddenly decided to wave a magic wand and drop, everything we asked for on top of us all at once, it would be very difficult for us to hire that many people all in one fiscal year. So there's going to have to be some year over year edging into that. But yes, that's the conversation that I think we need to have, is that we need to meet somewhere in the middle, because it's going to be very difficult for us to be able to staff that, even if we had all of those FTEs, because generally year over year, we continue to get more case filings. And so that number is just going to keep growing. And like I said, my focus in these reports, and just to clarify, if you go back and look at our workloads report that we publish on our website, it specifically says that it is the first part of what we intend to be a 2-part report, because the second part we're going to try to work with some stakeholders on over the course of the next 6 months to come up with a year-over-year plan that makes sense for trying to implement some of this. But it's very much going to be focused on what we have control over, which is hiring and recruiting and supporting the public defenders that are needed, as opposed to that larger question that obviously we can have some input on, but is largely out of our control to control those caseloads on the other side.
So finally, then the 6 million and the 2 million that you mentioned to Senator Wilborn, was that including the needing 400 or hiring 400 attorneys? I mean, what all is included in that ask? What numbers?
So the additional money that we're asking for pay parity with prosecutors in our budget request this year is aimed at our current employees and our FTE count that's currently on staff. So that's not any additional FTEs that we would have going forward. That just deals with our reality right now. The additional 25 FTEs would be on top of the 289 that we have now if we were to get all or some part of that funding.
So the 6 million and the 2 million would not be to add additional staff.
The 2 million for the 25, or the less than 2 million for the 25 additional FTEs would be to add additional FTE staff. But the pay parity with prosecutors, 6 million, is based on our current staffing.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Senator Haley.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And again, thank you for your responses and what has been a really significant review of where you are. A lot of what you've gone over, especially regarding the shortages that we do have, attorney shortages on both sides, prosecutorial and of course defense, harkens back to some of the questions and some of the discussions we had during the speedy trial and the need to find counsel, adequate counsel, as we enlarge that in response to the pandemic and the backlog. Out of last year came two new departments, and some of the numbers that you've given in response to both Senators Gossage and Wilburn.
Mm-hmm.
Wondering if you've incorporated those staff. There was, I forgot, is it independent, Neil? There was Wyandotte County and
yeah, and the 11th Judicial District, which is Cherokee, Crawford, and Labette counties. So yes, our current FTE count of 289.23 includes all of the FTE positions for those offices. We are currently in the process of opening those offices. We're hiring the chief public defender right now in the 11th Judicial District. We have hired the chief public defender for Wyandotte County. His name is David Mackerel, and was coming to us from the Federal Defender's Office in Kansas City, Kansas, and previously from our Johnson County Public Defender's Office before that. And those FTE counts are already incorporated in our workload study because they were already on our books and we knew they were going to be opening during this year. So, so the additional pay parity with prosecutors piece would apply to those FTE positions. The additional need or shortages that we have listed here of how many more attorneys we need already assumes that all of those positions would be filled.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Senator Olson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. You know, we're given a fiscal note when there's a bill presented on, how many bed space and that. Are we calculating this piece of it in that fiscal note? Because it seems to me, we look at the expense of housing someone and all that, but we're not looking, what is a proper, counsel if the state's going to pay. I mean, it's like we're putting a lot of people in prison, but have they all had really, attorney that's focused on them and their case? And maybe some of these cases take more than others, but, that's one area I wouldn't want to be skimping, but that's me.
Right. We can ask our research department or the folks who prepare the fiscal note, or if Heather, if you have an answer for us for that, or
Do you mind if I take a shot at that?
that'd be great.
I appreciate it. Our we typically get requested to respond to certain fiscal notes. There is definitely a very large number of bills that get filed that have impacts on our agency that are not always identified or requested. That is actually one of the things that internally we are trying to do better at, with some additional help from our attorneys, to be able to identify during the legislative session if we haven't been asked about a fiscal note, to make sure that we're reaching out on that, and trying to provide that. That's a fairly new process. And so we are also working on trying to improve the quality of the fiscal notes that we're providing, specifically to tie it into this question of what the impact actually is going to be on our staffing needs, because of these workload requirements being fairly clearly set out now, and being nationally accepted. And so, so we're trying to be better at that. And certainly there's a lot that happens during the legislative sessions. There's a lot of bills that we may not actually have an opinion on, or may be very negligible on. But we're trying to do a better job of assessing if there's something out there that we want to comment on, even if we don't get asked about it.
Just a quick follow-up. I think this is a good point where, I don't know where we could do this, but when we're doing a fiscal note on a bill, like, every note should have a fiscal note, what the bed space, all that. But not only, the public defenders, but there's probably other bills that have, certain agencies, that we need to make sure in these fiscal notes that we're looking at the true all cost. We deal with a lot of subjects here, so not all of them would be public defenders, but making sure everybody's represented. I don't know if there's a way to do that, to, when we're doing our fiscal notes, to be a little more thorough and make sure we have an actual cost. If it's a agency, if it's a healthcare, whatever, to make sure we know, hey, we're not just putting someone in prison. There's a cost for the psychiatric, the valuation, or all these things, what that cost is. Break it down. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. And that's the fiscal note, for those of you in the committee meeting room or following online, isn't something that a committee prepares, but that's from the Office of the Budget. That's the budget office is where those fiscal notes come from. So that would be important information, I would think, for them to take into consideration. And I want to mention also, kind of dovetailing with some of that, how important it is that we do have a robust criminal defense counsel, because as you, Heather, have stated in the first paragraph of your report, that the state of Kansas has a constitutional obligation under both the U.S. Constitution, the Sixth Amendment, and Sections 5 and 10 of the Kansas Constitution Bill of Rights, to provide effective assistance of counsel to each and every impoverished Kansan accused of a felony crime. And we, of course, have qualifications about your income level and things like that. But for our criminal justice system to function properly, we need both robust prosecutor side of things and both robust defense side of things. And while we all care a lot about keeping our communities safe and free from crime, it's how our criminal justice system works. Both the prosecutor and the defense need to be robust. So I especially appreciate you reminding us in your report of the obligation of the state of Kansas to provide a robust, effective assistance of counsel to impoverished Kansans accused of a felony crime, and then how you are doing in fulfilling that need and that obligation, making the legislature aware, and then bringing some suggested solutions. So I think there would be a need for continued conversation about where we currently are and what we can do to get us, keep us a robust system.
Yes, I suspect you'll probably be getting very sick of me uh, as I continue to come and give you updates on where we're at. But I think it's important that everyone has the knowledge that you need to be able to make the choices that you all are asked to make. So,
And I want to also add, you have also added that the legislature has also made it a statutory obligation to provide effective assistance of counsel to impoverished Kansans under statute as well, not just our Constitution. So thank you again for your robust presentation and the work you're doing for Kansans in the state of Kansas.
yes, thank you very much for allowing me the time.
Appreciate it. Thank you. Committee, then, that's the conclusion of our presentation by the Kansas State Board of Indigenous Defense Services, and that is also the end of our agenda. So I want to remind you that we are kind of off to a quiet start in Judiciary, which isn't always our nature, but be prepared that we get busy as we progress towards the end of session. And we will not then meet as a committee until Tuesday, January 23rd. So we will see you all on Tuesday then. Thank you very much. And we are